Hello. How's everybody doing? I'll just give everybody a minute to hop aboard the Facebook live train. But my name is Andrew Ramsbottom. I'm a senior project manager with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, and I'm here to continue our Wetland Wednesdays. Last week you probably met my colleague Andrea, and she talked to you about wetland creation down at the Lesser Street Spit. Today I'm going to be talking to you about inland wetland creation and restoration, and maybe we'll talk about the differences between the two of those things. And I also like to talk to you about some of the low water levels we're having this year. And oh, hello, how's everybody doing? And also like to talk about, in particular on this site, we've restored a wetland in the middle of an urban farm at the Kortright Center for Conservation. So I want to talk about why wetlands and agriculture are important, that they go hand in hand. So to give you some context, I'm going to flip around so you can have a better look at the wetland, and I'll tell you where we are. So here we are at the Kortright Center for Conservation in the Humber River watershed in a cattail dominated marsh that was restored in 2009. This was actually my first wetland restoration project, so I'm pretty fond of it. And we're really happy how this project turned out as well. So I'll be quiet for a minute so you can take in the sounds of the wetland. So right now you're probably hearing some birds chirping, probably some red-winged blackbirds hanging around. Haven't been able to spot anything yet. I was here yesterday, and we were here earlier in the morning, and there were a bunch of green frogs calling. If you don't know, or if you happen to hear a sound that sounds like a banjo being plucked really hard, that's a green frog. Just to give you some more context, the farm that surrounds this is the Living City Farm, and it's run by Akachi Farms. And the way Akachi is doing her farm business right now is there's tours on Thursdays and Sundays that you can book ahead, and they're also at the Woodbridge and Brampton Farmers Markets on Saturdays. And next year you can give a call and ask about their CSA. So that's really exciting that we have all this urban agriculture in TRCA conservation areas. This particular wetland drains to a small tributary of the Humber River called Marigold Creek. So you're probably wondering, why do we need to restore wetlands? Or at least I hope you're wondering that, because I have to do this every day for my job. And you know, wetlands are really vital for the health of our watershed. Historically, Southern Ontario featured an abundance of wetlands. With the growth of agriculture and land development, we lost a lot of those. The Toronto area alone has lost more than 85% of its original wetlands. So wetlands are also threatened by hotter and drier weather associated with climate change and the encroachment of native species, which we do have here. So I'll get into that in a second. The loss of wetlands has also been a detriment to native fish, reptile, amphibian, and bird populations. And so, you know, we're dealing with a lot more fragmented wetland habitat than we used to. So by restoring them, what we're hoping to achieve is increased biodiversity, increased wildlife habitat, improved habitat connectivity, flood attenuation, because wetlands act like sponges. They soak up all that rain and help prevent erosion and flooding downstream. Wetlands also help improve your water quality. All these wetland plants that you see around me are super good at soaking up excess nutrients. So in a farm context like here, you know, if there's fertilizers being added to crops, then the wetland can help mitigate that and prevent high nutrient loading going downstream. High nutrient loading downstream, you don't want that in your lake. That ends up with your algae issues and your beaches that you don't like to swim in. So having wetlands upstream of all those, you know, key recreational areas is really great. So, you know, there are a few different types of wetlands in Ontario. Specifically, we have swamps, bogs, and fens, and marshes. Here we're specifically talking about a marsh. And so marshes are characterized by fairly long inundation periods that allow these types of emergent plants to establish, and they may or may not have areas of open water. So I'll just turn over here to my right, and these plants with the big brown seed heads at the top are cattails. We have some floating pondweed in the deeper areas, and there's some whirligigs swimming around in there, some dragonflies, and we have some willows in the margins of the wetted area. And if you look a little ways away, that really tall grass in the background is unfortunately Phragmites, which is an invasive species. Right now it's confined to just the border of the wetland, and it hasn't encroached in on the cattails yet. So we're looking at how this goes over the next little bit to determine if it needs to be dealt with. I see a question from Jessica Nagy. What's an inundation period? I'm glad you asked, because this question has come up a lot lately. So an inundation period is the time that the wetland holds water. So, you know, a marsh may hold water for most of the season on a wet year, but in a year like we're having this year, the marsh is going to have a lot less water in it, and the inundation period of the wetland is going to be less. So, you know, we have this one permanent pool here, but you can see that all these cattails are relatively exposed there most of the time when there's higher water levels, like, you know, between 10 and 30 centimeters of water on top of those cattail roots. I've had a few calls that said, hey Andrew, gee, these wetlands aren't very wet this year, what's up with that? So we're actually having a very dry year. We haven't had a lot of rain since January. I know we've had a bit of rain the last few days, but TRCA stream gauges were noting that as of July 15th, we were actually 50% of our normal seasonal stream flows. So if you happen to be walking around and you're at your favorite wetland spot and it's dry, it's okay. There's probably not something wrong with your wetland. It's just that we're really short on rain this year. I see, I'm going to try and wave to someone. Hi Karen, how are you? Oh, and Gord. Oh, Gord, my associate director, old associate director is watching. Gord, thanks for the beard love. It's my COVID beard. So we are seeing super dry weather this year. Is this associated with climate change? If it continues over and over and over again, we might. Most models are predicting that we do have some longer dry spells in the summertime, punctuated with heavy rain events. So that's where we're gonna see these marsh wetlands drying up a little bit. You know, marshes can tolerate these dry years. If we continue to have successive dry years, what we'll probably see, and I'll flip you around again, is that all these trees on the margins and the wet meadow stuff will start creeping in to the wetland a little bit. And so, you know, naturally there's an ebb and flow of that boundary line between the wet meadow, the trees, and the emergent plants. And so it is expected that it shifts from year to year, but if we continue to have dry years, we'll probably see some shifts. And TRCA is actively working to look at what this means for our wetlands and how we can prevent them becoming dominated by invasive species. You may also be wondering, what about the wildlife during a dry year? Well, our wildlife have evolved with dry cycles of marshes, so they will know how to take care of themselves. There's a lot of questions usually about ducks. Ducks will fly to another location where there's a bit more permanent pool of water. Turtles are actually pretty good at walking, and they'll leave a dry wetland, or they may even bury themselves in the mud. And you know, this does make turtles maybe a little more vulnerable to predation while they're moving around looking for water. So, you know, keep an eye out for that. And, you know, frogs that have a really long period of tadpole development, they will be hit a little harder. Those ones like green frogs and bullfrogs need longer periods of wet, whereas like a gray tree frog, it doesn't need as long. It only needs a few months of the year to get those tadpoles going. So, you know, there will be shifts in what we see have good breeding years, but in general, our wildlife know how to take care of themselves. So I'd like to get into the nitty-gritty details of this site, if you don't mind. The Kortright Farm wetland was built in an old agricultural field, and it's kind of hard to believe that that is the case today, given what it looks like. But I have some maps and some photos, and I'd like to show you. So, also like to show you that the process that we use to find these wetlands is a bit complicated. It's not super willy-nilly. So I have a few tools at my disposal that TRCA has created over the years. One is this fancy acronym IRP, or Integrated Restoration Prioritization. Here we divide the watershed up into these little catchments, which is basically smaller areas where water drain to. And we rate each catchment on its need for restoration. And so this is based on how much natural cover is there. So that's wetlands, riparian cover, and forest. How much of the hydrology has been altered through development and agriculture and other processes. And we look at the importance of connectivity in a particular catchment. You know, is that catchment really important for connectivity and connecting good quality habitat patches that need work? If you look at this blue circle here, that's where we are. So, because we are at a conservation area, most of our conservation areas have pretty good scores. So what we're talking about here is taking a catchment, in this case a low priority catchment, and trying to make it a high a protection level catchment, which is where we have the best forest cover generally and the best wetland cover. You can see that this catchment probably has some lower scores due to development and, you know, some additional altered hydrology and lower natural cover scores. This might be my favorite tool of all. So we use arc hydro drainage lines, which are these blue dotted lines, as a way to predict where water flows over the landscape. In the past, where the wetland is here, this is our restored wetland. This was all agricultural field, and I've got some great photos to show you in a bit. What this line predicted is that we should have seen a wetland here, but instead we saw a fallow, abandoned agricultural field, and it made us scratch our heads and wonder why that was. I also have this fantastic hillshade, which is essentially a LiDAR contour map with a sun exposure on it to create shade in three-dimensional shape. So this can show you where the wetland basin is and would have been. So up here we have existing swamps, and then here we have our restored wetland. So these tools are fantastic. It allows me to do a lot of work from my desk before I actually even get out in the field. And if you can get a hold of one of these gems, the 1945 orthophotography is fantastic. See, here we can see that this is the existing swamp feature, and then this is the agricultural field, and right in here is where we restored the wetland. So one of the things we're looking for is right through here. See these little wet patches and then this line draining here. This kind of gives us an indication that there should be more water than what we're seeing here. And why there isn't is because someone's great-great-granddaddy put a tile drain, which is a clay pipe, into the ground to drain the field so that they could grow crops on it. Since this field was abandoned and was looking relatively marginal as far as the ability to grow in this area, TRCA decided to restore it and then promote urban agriculture in the surrounding areas. So this way we can create a situation where the wetland benefits the agriculture and vice versa. So here we have the design of the wetland, just really basic at its heart. So we build a berm, which is essentially an earthen plug, and then we set the new water elevation here, and then we plant trees around the wetland. I'll show you the side view, and then I'll just get into this. This is the area of urban agriculture. These are great. We had some very talented artists at TRCA make these up for us. So if you can picture that drainage line that predicted the tile drain, this is what that is underground. And so TRCA will come in with an excavator, break the tile drain in multiple places, and then we'll borrow some clay from these borrow pits. And then we'll build a clay key berm that ties in with the existing clay on the site. And what this does is it helps push the water table to the surface. And so we then contour the basin to promote submergent and floating plants, and then areas of emergent plant growth, and then into wet meadow and tree riparian areas. You'll notice we have some structural habitat like logs and stumps and perches, and these are really important to give excellent habitat opportunities to wildlife. Here, we're sliding off the stump, is a picture of what the site looked like pre-restoration. So you can see that this abandoned agricultural field is actually pretty wet. Here we have some reed canary grass through here, and there's probably some little patches of willow and cattails coming up. Here is the site 1 year after restoration. We're actually at the end of the year after restoration, same year. But you can see that the area for agriculture was tilled, and we have a nice riparian buffer around to maintain cover around the wetland and reduce any sediment loading into the wetland. Here's a picture from 2009, I believe, of the wetland, and you can start to see the emergent plants really establishing themselves. And here we have the wetland in 2011, and we have a really great fringe of emergent plants around the wetland that's established. So, if everybody's happy with all those details, I think it's time to show you a few other things, some key features of the wetland. So right now I'm walking up onto the berm of the wetland. I'm going to turn around and show you what I'm talking about in a second. So, where's the sun? Here we go. So here you can see the stone spillway, which is made of gabion stone, of the wetland. So this is designed by TRCA restoration staff and our water resources team to ensure it conveys the flows necessary to protect the berm and ensure the wetland continues to persist. This berm also does double duty because it's wide enough to allow tractors to cross over the berm and spillway, so that the agriculture can occur all the way around the wetland. So this area that I'm walking over right now is what contains that oh so important clay key that keeps the water backed up into the wetland. So I'm gonna go for a little bit of a walk and take you on a tour. So let's wander over here and I'll see if I can give you some more information. So the area you're seeing in front of me is the fallow agricultural field. When I talked to the farmer, she said they're farming in another location this year and that they'll likely be farming this entire field next year with hopes of really producing a ton of veggies. So that's pretty fantastic. On our right, you have some of our trembling aspen that was planted right after the wetland was restored. And we have some red osier dogwood, and we have some spruce. There's also some monarch butterflies fluttering around. You might notice there's some milkweed in here too. So really important for our monarch friends to have milkweed available to them. We have a songbird box ahead of us. This songbird box provides habitat for tree swallows, which love to eat insects over top of the wetland. And then I'm gonna continue my walk. And what you're gonna notice is that we start getting wetter and wetter as we get closer to the wetland. So here I'm passing a willow and some reed canary grass. And you'll see that the milkweed starts petering out a little bit. And now we start getting into the Phragmites, which is very dense, forms a really big mat of underground rhizomes, which is why it can be so invasive. And here we're coming to a strategically placed stump for some wildlife habitat and maybe a rare opportunity to sit and take in the mud flat that's left over after a wetland dries out for a little bit during the year. And so, you know, there's a lot less mud flats available for migrating shorebirds. And in the distance, you may or may not be able to tell that there are some sandpipers poking away at the mud flat. So although we don't have the water levels that we normally do, we're still getting a lot of wildlife use out of this marsh. I'm gonna turn, and in the distance, above the cattails, yeah, my finger may or may not be pointing at it, there is a wood duck box. So we installed a wood duck box here because wood ducks need tree cavities to nest in. And so we were able to put this here, and we check our wood duck boxes periodically to see if we've had nesting success. In front of me, and boy, oh boy, am I glad to see this. This is large fruited burreed, which I planted in my first year here with TRCA. So I'm really happy that we're seeing some success of some of the planted emergent vegetation. And then if you look over here, it pointed out, there's a long tube looking plant which has a cluster of seeds at the top. Those are soft stem bulrush, also something that was planted by TRCA staff. So what you'll find in our restored wetlands is that cattails tend to dominate when the wetland area is restored. As the soils become wet again, the existing seed bank explodes and we basically don't have to do any work and the cattails come back on their own. But if we want to add some diversity in the emergent vegetation and submergent vegetation, then we'll do some additional plantings. So I'll just give you a minute to take a look at this. Maybe I'll get into this one cattail here that is started opening up, probably from last year. It's a bit early, but we've had some technical difficulties, but we're back. So the first question that someone asked was, how long does it typically take to complete a restoration project like this? Well, I guess it's a tough question to answer. The planning and design phase can take quite a while. We like to observe the wetland for a year or so to understand what we're doing ahead of the work. So hopefully we've identified this location, a year ahead of when we actually plan to do the work. That doesn't happen all the time. The construction itself, this wetland probably take 3 to 4 weeks to do the construction aspects with, an excavator and a loader and a skid steer. And then we'd probably be, so let's assume that we did that work in the summertime when it's nice and dry. So we spend about 4 weeks doing the construction. Then in the fall, we would come back in and we would spend a few days to a week planting the area. Then let's say we've decided that we're not done planting, we'll come back again in the spring and do a couple days of planting in the spring. And then we can see what aquatic plants come up that summer. And then we can decide to put additional aquatic plants in or not. We like to use, a flexible decision-making framework for how much effort we want to put into the wetland, because often nature takes care of itself once we get the soil and hydrological conditions correct. So, if we do those things right, then, nature does a lot to bring the wetland back. I think earlier I talked about wetland creation and restoration and didn't get into it too much. The big difference is restoration is generally where a wetland was previously, and you generally try and find a reference site that you want to restore the wetland to. So in this area, we had existing swamp features nearby, and then we restored a marsh feature. So, we probably could have looked at expanding the swamp complex here as well, but for the purposes of the farm and the access across the spillway, providing a slightly higher berm with a bigger spillway, and it provided, a good opportunity to create that crossing. So, a marsh worked really well here. Any other questions? I think that was it. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I'd like you to check out the TRCA Facebook page for past Wetland Wednesdays. Yes, yeah, it is a bit of a long process, but it's exciting, and I would say after 10 years of working for TRCA, it's super rewarding. That's why I'm still here doing it. So thank you for your question, and if anyone wants to know more, there is some information on our restoration work. I'd love to do some traveling and teach. Thank you. Anyways, take care out there, and we'll see you guys again soon, hopefully. Thanks very much. Bye.